Beneath the Red Sands. By J.W. Steele. The first time Dr. Sylvia Carr saw a worm rise from the Martian soil, it wasn't the horror of the thing that shook her. It was the way it moved, a sinuous, winding ripple beneath the surface, just enough to disturb the red dust before disappearing again. The parasite was hideous to behold, like a scarlet centipede. She had spent the last 5 years in Bradbury Colony, the first permanent human settlement on Mars, and she had learned to trust that slow-dragging pulse of dread in her gut. When Mars whispered, you listened. Zorbid knew about the worms, of this she was certain. The pharmaceutical giant wasn't just another biotech company, they were the first to discover the organism 50 years ago. Their advanced AI bots had been studying the parasite long before Bradbury Colony was established. But their research had been hidden, locked away, like some kind of secret unknown to the world. When she tried to report the sighting to Chief Science Officer Dr. Ronald Keegan, her concerns were dismissed without a second thought. As Zorbid Labs' top authority in the colony, Keegan controlled Bradbury with an iron grip. He listened, for a moment, then smirked, that same condescending expression all company men wore, as if he had a memo in his back pocket that could explain away any problem, no matter how alarming. His face flushed and he said, "We're here in the interest of xenogenetic research, Dr. Carr, and that is why we brought you on board. You would do well to remember that." He slapped his palm hard on the desktop. "Listen to me, doctor, and listen good. Forget about any hallucinations you may have witnessed out on the blood dunes. They have little to do with Zorbid. But the worms weren't hallucinations. They were real, and Dr. Carr knew they were dangerous. Zorbidex knew it too, otherwise, they wouldn't have spent billions funding the Bradbury project. Dr. Carr had known the truth from the start, there was no leaving Mars. Zorbid controlled everything, including the shuttles, which were locked down under strict security. No one left the colony without corporate approval, and approval was something no one ever got. She was trapped, her fate resting in the hands of the pharmaceutical entity, knowing they would decide when, or if, her usefulness ended. So she waited, watching the days blur together, torn between two certainties: there would be no rescue, and something beneath the sand was getting ready to attack. Mars wasn't supposed to be like this. The billionaires, the corporations, the high and mighty Earth governments promised something better. They called Mars a new frontier, the brave next step in human evolution. You work 10 years under the contract, they said, and you'll own a piece of the colony. A pressurized shelter, a plot of land, maybe even a little terraforming permit if you played nice. But Sylvia knew the truth. Nobody was getting off this rock alive. Dr. Carr wasn't an explorer or a thrill seeker, she was a molecular biologist. And what she had been studying for the last year had nothing to do with bacteria, or viruses, or prion. It was the spores. They clung to the Martian worms like flecks of rust. No one knew what they were, only that exposure to them meant a slow, gruesome death. The infected rotted from the inside, flesh turning black, skin sloughing off in sheets. Internal liquefaction came next. Bradbury Colony lost 43 people in the first wave. Zorbid called it an unexpected viral incident. Sylvia called it a sacrifice. Because she found the biological event summary that detailed every aspect of their terrible demise. Thousands had already died before Mars was even colonized. Back on Earth, in corporate-funded labs where human test subjects were fed pieces of worm flesh in exchange for a fat paycheck and a quiet cremation. Zorbidex needed the spores. They needed the deaths. Why? Because they weren't just studying the infection. They were creating an antidote. Not for the colonists. Not for the workers. For the executives back home, for the billionaires who still dreamed of owning Mars. The antidote was the endgame. Control the cure, control the planet. Sylvia thought she had time to figure out her next move. She was wrong. Because that night, the worms came back. And this time, they didn't burrow back down. The air recycler hummed softly in her hab unit. The wind outside whispered over the dome, carrying with it the faint static of a dust storm rising on the horizon. Dr. Carr sat at her desk, staring at the classified toxology reports glowing on her tablet. Someone knocked. A single, soft tap. Then another. It wasn't at her door. It was coming from the walls. A deep, slow, scraping sound. Like fingernails against steel. She stood, pulse hammering, and pressed her ear to the cold metal duct in the corner. A pause. Then a hollow thump. Then another. Then another. Then a sound that froze her to the marrow of her bones, the slow, patient wheezing of something alive. Something breathing. She staggered back, heart pounding. The red dirt outside shifted. A ripple, no longer subtle. The soil broke apart like something was rising, forcing its way up. Not one. Not a dozen. Hundreds of them. The worms weren't waiting anymore. They were ready. By the time Dr. Carr ran to the main colony hub, it was too late. The sky rained fire as the first hab domes ruptured, crack spider webbing across the reinforced glass. Evac sirens blared, red lights strobing across the complex. People ran screaming into the storm, only to collapse, their suits punctured from the inside as something crawled up their throats. Zorbid had known. They had always known. They had built Bradbury Colony directly on top of a sandstalker nest, whether by ignorance or intent, Sylvia could no longer tell. The worms weren't attacking us. We were the invaders. Sylvia saw Dr. Keegan sprinting toward the last remaining shuttle. She followed, she didn't know why. Maybe for answers. Maybe just to watch him die. She caught him at the loading ramp, and grabbed his collar. "How long have you known about this, you yellow maggot?" She screamed over the wind. Keegan's face was white. His lips quivered, but not from fear. From infection. His jaw unhinged. His teeth cracked apart. Something inside him, a worm, thick and glistening, began to force its way out. Dr. Carr let go. Keegan screamed. She turned and ran. The last thing she heard was the wet, tearing sound as Keegan melted to a black puddle of slime. Weeks later, a distress signal from Mars reached Earth. Bradbury Colony was gone. But there was no rescue mission. No response from Earth. Because they already knew. They had always known. And they were still watching. Waiting. For the antidote. For the next colony. For the next 1,000 lives to burn. Because Zorbid Labs wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. And Mars wasn't empty. Not anymore.